What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and as most of you guys know, Muse is going to be a major player in the Daredevil Born Again series, or at least that seems to be the case. So I figured what better time to do a breakdown on his character than right before the show launches. So Muse, I wouldn't go so far as to say he's a one and done character, but he was introduced in the Charles Soule run of Daredevil and killed in the Charles Soule run of Daredevil. So he doesn't have an overly lengthy run in Marvel. He was only around really for like a couple years. And so the way he was originally introduced, and I think it's an important thing to specify here, he was kind of a holdover from the Inhumanity event. And there's two reasons why I say that. The first is because while he was very ambiguous and we didn't really know a whole lot about him, it seemed like he was an Inhuman. And I believe in Daredevil, either 598 or issue number 600, it was specified that he was an Inhuman. But Charles Soule actually responded to a tweet where somebody asked him, like, what's the deal with Muse? And his response was, well, it's kind of better if you leave it ambiguous, right? So he didn't really want a whole lot of information about Muse's backstory to be thrown out there. But the reason why I talk about Inhumanity is because for most of you guys who read Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, you know that there was a point in the story where Black Bolt detonated the Terrigen bomb. And when that happened, it started activating all these Inhumans around the world that nobody knew existed. Nobody knew that they were Inhumans. And so what it did is it kind of led to the Inhuman race itself kind of becoming its own policekeeping force, in the sense that there were all these story arcs of rogue Inhumans and trying to create little factions and tribes that existed outside of Black Bolt and the Inhuman royal family. But over time, Marvel started consolidating all these stories down to the point that those Inhumans who were not inherently violent and were interested in being part of the Inhuman royal family, or at least operating under the control of the Inhuman royal family, were essentially sent away to New Attilan, where they would just kind of reside as, part of the Inhuman race. But for those who were exceedingly violent, in the case of someone like Muse, they were actually thrown in prison. And so because of that, Muse was just sort of one of the Inhumans who existed out there that no one had really heard of until he started making his move. And the way it played out in the original Daredevil run with Charles Soule is that he just kind of appeared as this incredibly grotesque artist, using essentially human beings, even humans and other Inhumans, as art pieces, in the sense that in the beginning, he had actually sent Blindspot, the sidekick of Daredevil, essentially an address, right, to this warehouse where there was like this great big huge mural. And it was actually a mural that was made out of human blood. And so what this did is it kind of turned the story into this whodunit mystery type thing. And truth to tell, for a lot of people who have been reading Daredevil for a long time, it had a lot of strong hints to the old Frank Miller run, which I think is one of the reasons why people loved the Charles Soule run of Daredevil so much. But what ends up happening is that following this mural in blood, because no one really knows who did it, and because Matt Murdock, of course, is working with the authorities and so on and so forth, that Muse comes back, and then he actually defaces his own mural, and then he writes this kind of crazy message on it. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was something like, you're not as good as your last work, or only as good as your last artwork, or something along those lines. But essentially, he was making it a cat and mouse game, right? No one knew that he had done it. And so because he saw it as a public art piece, he actually directed Matt Murdock and everybody involved with the investigation to like a new location. And when they got there, there were like these Inhumans who had been killed by Muse and propped up in these really bizarre positions where they were just doing like regular mundane things. And so what ends up going on is, because of Matt Murdock's enhanced senses, he picks up on the fact that Muse is around there somewhere, right? Just kind of watching how people react to his work. Because one of the things that Matt really hits on is the idea that like killers want to be found, and Muse wants people to know that he's doing this. And ultimately, it seemed like Muse wanted Daredevil to catch him. And so that actually ends up happening at a point in time. That there comes a point in the story when Daredevil catches up to Muse, and then you realize he's more than just some kind of horrific, killer who's decorating, places with people's bodies and stuff like that, that he actually has abilities. Specifically, he had the ability to kind of pull in virtually any and all sensory perception around him, which basically gave him the ability to distort the abilities of Matt Murdock. So it would like kind of throw Matt off kilter and so on. But it was a way to kind of show that like Muse would not be easily caught by Matt if the two of them ever end up confronting each other again. And so following that, what ends up going on is that Judge Laird, who had been in charge, or at least was involved in the entire situation, actually ends up ordering for the entire crime scene to be blocked off. And that's where Muse's motivation switches from kind of presenting these crime scenes where he wants Matt to catch him, to actually taking offense. Because at that point, it's a matter of the fact that, like, the authorities are trying to block his work from being seen by the world. So he actually ends up kidnapping the judge along with a few other people. And then this led to the intervention of Blindspot. Now, Blindspot at that point in time, due to just his seemingly inexperience when it came to dealing with brutal killers, guys like Muse, was actually warned by Daredevil, do not go after him on your own. But Blindspot did it anyway. And where Blindspot was initially able to get the upper hand on Muse, ultimately he was captured. And in fact, that took place in Daredevil Volume 5, issue number 13, which is when the story began to shift yet again, because what you end up getting is this incredibly brutal encounter between Muse and Blindspot. Because when Daredevil finally catches up to them, he actually, or at least Muse, actually gouges out the eyes of Blindspot. And it's one of these things where he's kind of like, you're living by the name, but you're not actually operating by the name. So we will help you become your namesake. But the important thing to get here is that the entire time, it's not really him just being vindictive. He considers all of this to be works of art. Not only that, there's this instance where they're going through the warehouse and they end up finding all these bodies that Muse had used to paint the original mural that are quite literally being drained of blood in Marvel at that point in time. Some of them are still alive, some of them were dead, but of course at that point it's a matter of trying to free them all, and Muse used that opportunity to essentially make an escape. Now, because of the fact that Matt Murdock had been working with the authorities, that by the time Muse escapes, when he and Matt encounter each other yet again, that Muse takes off to a rooftop, he's ultimately captured and he's arrested. But a very important thing to know about his character, and this is what made him so interesting in the Charles Soule run, is that there was no redeeming aspect of Muse. It wasn't as though he was doing this because he was a guy who was down on his luck at some point in time and was creating these gruesome pieces of art, in order to appease some, sycophantic villain out there and make some kind of money for himself. He didn't really care about the people that he was attacking, and he didn't understand why anybody else cared as well. It was a complete and total disregard for the sanctity of life. And that element is actually what drove Matt Murdock to hate him so much. But what's really ironic here, and I would go so far as to surmise, that was supposed to be the end of it for Muse. He wasn't really supposed to show back up again in Marvel Comics, but ultimately he did. And the mileage varies, right, from one fan to the next on whether or not the second half of Muse's appearance in Charles Soule's run was as good as the first. The reason why I say that is because when Muse reappeared during the Charles Soule run on Daredevil, it was part of Devil's Reign. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are already familiar with Devil's Reign, but for those of you guys who aren't, and because it's going to be a major focal point in Daredevil Born Again, I think seasons 1 and 2, that it can't hurt to refresh. And so Devil's Reign, while it had a lot of lead up to it, the long and short of it is that Wilson Fisk, operating as the kingpin of New York, had essentially had his mind tampered with by Matt Murdock in order to strip the knowledge from Wilson Fisk that Matt Murdock was Daredevil. And so while Wilson Fisk didn't know exactly what it was that he had been made to forget, hence, him losing those memories, he knew that Daredevil was the one behind it. And so because Matt had actually gone so far as to taunt Wilson Fisk about what had happened to him, Fisk in turn launched a campaign to make superheroes illegal in the city of New York. And so the entirety of Devil's Reign is literally that exact plot. And so you essentially had almost a kind of Civil War type story where you had the underground superheroes, Secret Avengers, if you want to give them that name. But Muse's involvement in this shifted away from these grotesque murders and set pieces to him actually almost kind of being like a propaganda piece for the anti-Devil's Reign movement, which is to say, literally the story opens up with Daredevil 598, where Muse has been running around after having escaped from New Attilan and, killing various guards and so on and so forth, where he's doing these graffiti pieces. But because of his actions, he's almost this kind of like Banksy type character, minus, of course, Banksy doesn't commit mass crime or anything. But these set pieces are things like Daredevil, where it says, like, I am not a crook. Of course, again, modeled after Richard Nixon. Spiders are people too. But there was also a little bit of social commentary there, right? Where he has this whole graffiti piece with Frank Castle And it says like, you love me and you love what I do, even if you're not willing to admit it, kind of reading between the lines in that last little tidbit there. And it's in that moment when we're kind of shown that piece with Frank Castle that you do see a little bit of the original Muse coming back in his old school run, which is to say that when these two girls show up, they're kind of enamored by him because he's almost achieving this sort of, minor level celebrity fame. And that they do take a picture with him, which actually shows that he doesn't really seem to have a traditional physical form, that as far as cameras go, that he's seemingly imperceptible with the exception of his eyes. But then when he's interrupted by cops after essentially threatening these girls and saying like, I can make you famous, right? He's going to like kill them and turn them into pieces. He actually ends up massacring the cops and then in turn stringing the cops up in a variety of ways along the Punisher set piece, kind of a testament to the Punisher's anti-authority perspective. But because of the fact that this took place during Devil's Reign, the only real major thing that comes out of it is that Wilson Fisk actually uses the actions of Muse as a way to put forward the dangerous nature of superheroes. That people like Muse represent how chaotic and dangerous superheroes are to the greater society, and then essentially use the propaganda work of Muse against the superhero community. The real reality of Muse himself and his ultimate end doesn't actually come until you basically get the revenge match, for lack of a better word, between Blindspot and Muse. Now, what was particularly interesting here in the final fight between Blindspot and Muse is that it actually coincided with the main Devil's Reign story, which was like Daredevil and Luke Cage and essentially the underground superheroes taking the fight directly to Wilson Fisk. And so while they're all doing that, Blindspot is dealing with Muse. Now, technically, it actually happens between issues 597 to issues number 600, but the reality is that the meat and potatoes of it really happen with issue number 600. And it's actually in that story, in that particular issue, that you learn that Blindspot had regained his vision by way of what was called the Beast. Now, the Beast is one of these things from essentially the Hand mythos, and it would probably behoove us at some point in time to do Daredevil's Shadowland, because that's when Daredevil is possessed by the Beast, the god, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, of like the mystical ninja organization, the Hand. But Blindspot had attained his eyesight because of the Beast and was partially possessed by him, or at least influenced by him. And in fact, in that particular story, there's a point where the Beast is telling him, like, you need to kill Muse, like, you should kill this guy. But what's particularly interesting is that Blindspot never really got an answer from Muse for why he did what he did in the first place. And even we as the audience didn't necessarily get an answer, right? The obsession he had with Daredevil was more contextual than anything else. And it was kind of our conclusion to draw, given the kind of statements that Muse would make in the original appearance from Charles Soule and the kind of things that he would do and the cat and mouse game that he was playing with Matt. But there's this point in the story where Blindspot asks him, like, why do you do what you do? Why do you kill people like this? And the response of Muse is, because it's the same reason that you want to kill me right now, right? Like, it makes you better, it makes you stronger. And he goes like on this great big huge rant about how, in essence, he seemed to kind of be struggling with like an inferiority complex. But given the confidence and the way that his character functioned, that doesn't really seem to be an adequate way to explain it. So I don't know exactly how to explain it here. But the general gist was that he just loved using human beings as live art. And in fact, there was this point when he was talking to Blindspot about his original escape and why it is that he escaped in the first place, why he left New Attilan and came back out again. And it seemed more or less that the way Muse viewed the superhero community is that it was just one gigantic delusion, that superheroes were just human beings who were dressing up and they had some powers and they were going out into the world, but it was just a great big huge dance. They fight their villains fight them, the villains are defeated, they go to jail, the villains get out, the superheroes fight them again, and it goes over and over and over and over again. And so for him, he saw it as more of like a play, right? Just a giant work of art. And so that seemed to be why his motivations were rooted in using human beings as set pieces. That was kind of the role he saw himself playing in this greater play of superheroes versus supervillains. But again, a lot of the answers that he gave were very ambiguous and very much up to interpretation. And so the way that his death essentially came about was that instead of Blindspot fully giving over to the Hand, that ultimately he chooses not to kill Muse. And Muse is like, no, right? I'm not going to be arrested. If the story's going to end, it's going to end under my terms. And so he actually just walks into a fire and allows himself to burn to death. And that's the end of Muse. Like, we really haven't seen hide nor hair from his character ever since. And there's no reason to believe that we will. Again, Charles Soule introduced him for the purpose of telling a particular kind of story. And so he's not going to be some recurring villain. At least I hope not, right? Muse is actually one of those very few instances in Marvel Comics where an incredibly captivating and fantastic villain is introduced for a purpose. And when that purpose is served, the villain goes away. And I think because of that, it's actually allowed him to stay popular all this time. So again, it's one of these cool elements of Marvel when it comes to the Daredevil mythos, right? Having just this really twisted, sick villain like Muse that just does really sick and twisted stuff. So let me know what you guys think down in the comment section. I am incredibly excited for Daredevil Born Again, but again, not a whole lot to go on with this character. So thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.